And you'll see the record button up in your upper left-hand corner now.
On the
All
iPad,
right.
on the
What?
iPad is upper right.
Oh, okay. You'll see it somewhere in the upper corners. So anyways, welcome to the Book Club Bible Stories Class 1. We're taking on Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. So essentially the creation stories today. One of the things I do want to just give you a sort of disclaimer about at the beginning of the Bible stories, okay? I want to give you just a quick rundown of my philosophy of Bible studies. So I am going to go through, we're going to hit everything in these stories. Much of what has happened sort of historically in Christianity is Christianity was very good about talking about everything in the Bible up to about World War II in America. When the World War II generation came home, remember, this is a generation that had lived through the Depression. This is a generation that then fought the worst war we've ever had, okay? They wanted their kids to grow up with normalcy, with comfort, and without all the stresses and pain that they grew up with in their childhood. Remember, their childhood was the Great Depression, and then often when they were still, teenagers, they were off to World War II, okay? This was a noble and understandable reaction, but I think has had a negative consequence for Christianity insofar as most Christians, even if you were to go to church every week and be super faithful and read your Bible, are going to run into a lot of stories that you've never heard before. Okay. Or you're going to run into stories you've heard before, but they got whitewashed. And there's parts of those stories that either were totally skipped or has been taken out of context time and time and time again. So one of the things I'm hoping to do with this Bible study is to hit both, is to go through everything. So we're not skipping parts of stuff. This is why I'm just like chapter 1, chapter 2, next week, guess what? Chapter 3, chapter 4, right? We're just going to go in order for a while. And I'm going to take some time to point out parts of the Bible that either we think we know, but we maybe don't know with the surety we think we do, or those parts of the Bible we really don't know. And hopefully in a slightly humorous way. But my humor can be a little impious at times. So just hang on for that. I never mean to offend or anything. But again, and my goal being sort of to push y'all to just look at things in a slightly different light than maybe we've normally seen. Y'all okay with that? All right. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if I can remember how to do that successfully, and then I'll get you over to a PowerPoint. What I'm hoping we do pattern-wise is I'm going to just sort of introduce the class, go to the first chapter. I'm going to note the things that jumped out to me. Then I'm going to invite you guys to note the things that jumped out to you. And then I'm going to go to we'll go to the second chapter. I'll note the things that jumped out to me, ask y'all what jumped out to you when you read it. And then we'll go back. In this case, since we're only doing 2 chapters today, because they're pretty thick chapters, then I have one thematic, sort of something you have to look at both chapters to pick up on that I want to talk about, okay? And so I'll bring that up. So let me know if this pattern works for you. If it doesn't, there's lots of ways I can approach stuff, okay? Cool? All right, well, let's dig into this then. Let's see if I share screen. All right, let's see. There we go. And I'm going to shrink you all down. Now, when I shrink you all down, I can only see one of you at a time. So please speak up so that I can see you, okay? Because if you're waving your hands, I will not see you. Okay? And you can see who I can see at this moment. So let me put this into speaker. No, okay, yeah. All right. All right, so today, Genesis chapter 1, chapter 2, we're starting at the beginning, and when we get to the end of Genesis, we can vote on what we want to do next. So just keep that in mind. So chapter 1. So chapter 1 is one of the 2 stories of creation, okay? The 3 big things that sort of jumped out to me when I was reading was God saw that everything was good, okay? Like it says that over and over and over in the Hebrew. God said it was good. He would create something and then say it was good, right? he did not say it was perfect. There's a different word for perfect. He didn't say it wasn't bad. It wasn't like, well, that wasn't bad. He didn't say it was, he said it was just good. And I think that's an important thing for us to remember, because often as humans, we push ourselves to try to be perfect. We push ourselves to try to be the absolute best of something. And if we aren't the best, we look at ourselves and we think, oh man, I failed. But that's not even how God, the one being in this universe that is perfect, God doesn't even shoot for perfection. God's like, hey, I created that. That was like B work. I'm okay with that. B is good. I'm good with that. And if God is good with that, I always urge people to remind themselves and be grace-filled with themselves that good is good enough.
But I would also point out that when he talked about the totality, it was very good.
He did note it was very good. And actually I was going to get to that. That's in chapter 2, though.
Okay. Okay. I'm
It
sorry.
is.
Didn't
No,
mean
oh,
to
you
skip
don't have
it.
to apologize. You don't have to apologize.
Keep it in.
No, you're right. In the
No,
totality.
it was in chapter 1.
Verse 31 of chapter 1.
Oh, it is chapter 31. Okay, you got me then. See, this is what I want. I want back and forth. All right. So, okay, so you're right. So it was all very good.
Mm-hmm.
Still not the same word as perfect.
Right.
Okay. No, but a good catch, Karen. Way to go.
But do you
Other
think
thoughts?
maybe the writers didn't know the word perfect back then?
They did. We know that there is a Hebrew word.
There was a version of, okay, well,
There is.
see, that's why we have you, because you.
There is a version of perfect. They don't use it. They use, you're right, good, 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 very good.
Okay.
So maybe instead of being okay with B's, we're okay with A minuses.
Yeah.
Okay, I know. We have a whole, yeah.
Stretching.
Yes, I know. We have a whole bunch of people who are like, I got only A's at school. No. That's all right. My wife is one of those. All right. So verse 27, I want to bring everyone quickly to 127. The reason I want to make sure we all stop at chapter 1, verse 27. I'm going to read it. Now I'm using the NIV. Everyone's got slightly different translations, so your translation might be slightly different. But I want to bring this out because this verse has been unfairly used, and in fact, I think used inversely than what it was meant to be historically. So that's why I want to stop and make sure we talk about it. So 27, it says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Okay. Now, even when you look at the English in that, you realize that when the word man is being used, a more proper word is probably humanity, right?
Mhm.
So God creates humanity in his own image. Because had the writers meant male only, they wouldn't be able to then say male and female, he created them, right?
Mhm.
Okay. So it is true that the reason the word man or mankind is often used there is because the Hebrew does have a masculine. Okay. But would have been understood in the same way that if we were 30 years ago and someone said, well, I want peace for all of mankind, we would understand that person meant all of humanity, not just all men, and whatever happens to women, right? Okay. It's important that we get that, because what often happens is that people will take that first one, God created man in his own image, okay, out of chapter 1, and then stop, right? They don't read the rest of verse 27. And then they jump to the story of Eve's creation in chapter 2, where she comes out of the rib. And it will say something along the lines of God created man, and from man God created woman. Okay, but that's way out in chapter 2. Okay. Some really awful theologians will try to stitch the first part of 27 here with the story of Adam's rib and try to use that as an argument for sort of male superiority. It was used extensively as an argument against female ordination. Okay. In fact, right now, if you were to go to the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination in the United States, it's an evangelical denomination, they would point to an argument that God is here, God created man as photocopy 1, and God created woman as photocopy 2. That's why men are superior. Like they would literally say that. You can go to like to their website and they will argue that. But they're arguing it off of a really ridiculous basis. Because if you read all of verse 27, of which they're only using the first clause, you would see that God created humanity in God's image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Therefore, both men and women are equally created in the eyes of God. You follow?
I have a question, I guess, sort of, or an observation, and maybe it's my version. I'm using the New Revised Standard Version, and in 26, my version at least says, "Let us make humankind in our image." So maybe there was a God, female and male.
Okay, we can get to that. Okay, so the answer is absolutely there would have been for the writers. Okay, when you dig up old statues of Yahweh from early Jewish traditions, you will often find a female statue with God who is understood to be his co-equal wife. That is from the sort of pre-monotheistic time period of Judaism. But it is during the pre-monotheistic time period of Judaism that would have heavily influenced the earliest of the Jewish writings, of which Genesis is among them. So that is a very good point. So that is where you get, then God said, let us. Now, the other way to interpret that would be to say those are the other members of the Trinity. Insofar as us meaning Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, because John says that the Word has been there since the beginning. Because in the beginning, there was the Word. So there are two legitimate cases that can be made. You can make the sort of later theological argument that this is a Trinitarian, pro-Trinitarian statement, or you can make the more anthropological, probably archaeological argument that this is probably a hint to an earlier polytheistic Judaism. I think both arguments have some validity to it. That sort of answer your question, Karen?
It's helpful, but it also solidifies for me how hard it is for me to read the Bible without all of the background information that people who've studied it more, like yourself or other religious people who've been to seminary have, because I don't have the same context.
Yeah, no. But what I would say to that, though, is don't give up reading the Bible, because like what I just said there was important, okay?
Mm-hmm.
But the sort of things that actually shape your spirituality and shape your faith and shape your relationship with God aren't gonna hinge on either the Trinity or the pre-polytheistic world of Judaism. You know what I mean?
Right.
So like kudos to you for being so smart as to catch that out of 26. Okay? Like that you should really like feel good of how like observant you were to say, hey, hold it, who's us? Okay. But don't worry about it, okay? Because you're not going to get something wrong, because again, and I say this a lot, is like the things that matter in Christianity are generally subjective. Meaning, like, how do I connect myself to God is a question only I can really answer, and others can help me figure it out, sure. but each person's connection, which is like the most important thing, is going to be as diverse and wonderful as the people out there, you know? And the Bible, at least in my past, has always helped me because I will occasionally find myself in there or find situations I'm in there. But no, great observation. So 27, I bring that out because if you guys ever hear someone make that argument of women are a secondary photocopy, I want to make sure that you just slam them being like, now hold on, let's read all of 27 here. Because that's not at all what's going on.
And by the way, we have Peterson's Messenger translation, and in 27 it says God created human beings.
And that is one of the big things you'll find. Depending on your version, it may just go to humanity. NIV and others that are trying to be more precise than readable will default to man because there is a masculine take on it. Just like in Spanish, you have masculine and feminine, like señor and señorita. You have the same in Hebrew. So they're trying to default to the masculine, but then it misleads people as to what it is, because humanity is probably really the better translation. But I don't envy the people who do the translation stuff. There's so many hard things. All right, verse 28. It's worth noting our entire modern concept of a marriage ceremony doesn't exist. Okay? God's concern for them is that they are good for each other, that they love each other, and he basically says, go be fruitful and multiply. There is no stress on the modern concept of a marriage ceremony. I like to just point that out because God cares about the marriage, not the wedding, or the lifelong commitment, not the ceremonial aspects as much, where we, at least in the West, get hung up on the ceremonial aspects, sometimes to the detriment of the actual like living organism that is a marriage. You know what I mean?
I kind of thought it was because God was just trying to populate the earth.
You know, it's a good way to get there, right?
I don't read love. I don't even see love in here. It's just like, go populate the earth. I'll get to love
That
later.
is a legitimate read. That is a legitimate read.
When Jesus came along, love entered in.
I like to think, but I'm reading into the text that Adam and Eve loved each other. But you're right. There's no specific evidence. You could totally read it as a just population thing. What other things? So that's what jumped out to me in chapter 1. What jumped out to you guys? Anything else?
Just, you know, the first sentence, God created heavens and earth. When I was a little kid, that was pretty straightforward. We knew where heaven was and where earth was. And that seems to have changed over the years, one's concept of it. And
sorry, you keep cutting in and out. Is that just me?
Can you hear me? Am I okay?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Sorry, I just had a weird internet issue for a second there.
So you know, now we realize we have the earth and the sky above us, which we call the ends. But we learned that all of this is maybe 13 or 14 billion years old. And so far we know there's about 13.6 billion light years out there before we kind of think it's ending. How do we, do we read this as it probably was, the people at that time looking up to the sky and down to the earth, and this is what God did? Or is there any way to, and of course, I mean, it's kind of science and Christianity, but I'm saying, how do we in this Bible study or as Christians, can we put all of that together in one lump, or are we looking at different things here?
I definitely think there's a good argument for the existence of heaven. Though it's worth noting, depending on one's give me just a second to figure out how to answer. So so there are two concepts of how where the soul goes when you die. Okay. Those of you who've done pub theology, we've taken this on a few times. So so in Christianity, the only requirement when it comes to the understanding of the afterlife is that you understand that there will be a bodily resurrection at the final day. Okay. That's what's in the creeds, right? You see the Apostles' Creed, Nicene Creed, the Athanasian Creed. And that's because over and over in the New Testament, you'll see Jesus talk very specifically about the bodily resurrection in the final days. Okay. Paul does too. You also have a number of prophets who will note this, which is why it becomes this very solid theological basis, because there's lots of evidence in the Bible. But when you get to the actual question of when I die, I know I'm going to get body resurrected in the final day. That's really solid. Lots of biblical evidence. What about going to heaven and like hanging out up there until the final day? And Christianity actually splits, and Lutherans can go either direction. Okay. One direction, which is where I go, is to say there is a heaven. There's a handful of biblical references I would go to argue it. And when you die, you go up to heaven, you hang out there with God and everyone else you love until the final day, and then everybody comes back for the bodily resurrection. Okay. So I'm a pretty traditionalist guy on that, or as my father, who takes the opposite position, would say, I'm the really modernist guy, because his position is technically older. His older position is that your soul goes to sleep. So you die, and then you wake up, it's the final day. Sort of like the way when you fall asleep, have you ever been like super tired? You fall asleep and you close your eyes and you swear your alarm goes off like 2 seconds after you closed your eyes. But you know you closed your eyes at like 9 and you woke up and it's now 5 and you're like, no, because you didn't dream, or if you did, you don't remember any of it. You've all had that, right?
Right.
Okay. That would be the argument of what's called soul sleep. Basically saying, and my dad would say, well, yeah, your 5 references, Matt, are cute and adorable, but I can explain all of them away. Me and my dad love to debate this. They've been debating it since I was in high school. So you can go either way as a Lutheran. So to answer your question over where heaven is, my answer would be heaven is sort of beyond our existence. It isn't something science is going to run into with a rocket ship. It's a transcendent reality, because it's a place where the soul, which is something that transcends the physicalness of ourself. It's the place where love and caring, compassion, willpower, things like that come from for me. Okay. And just like a scientist couldn't tell me like right there's where willpower comes from, or right there's where love comes from in any perfect sense, I would argue that you can't point to heaven and say, well, it's up there or down there, because it just is. Now, my father would say there is no heaven like that. Maybe there's a place where God resides, but there's no heaven where anyone but maybe God resides. Because you're going to die, you're going to fall asleep, and you're going to wake back up and stand up in your new bodily resurrection. Questions, thoughts, comments? Everyone's looking at me either bored or confused.
It's the wording that throws me in chapter 1.
Okay.
In describing the creation of the heavens from the oceans, let's say, they didn't keep using the word, at least the one I read, it was using the word vault.
Okay.
And I don't know if that's the same thing in heaven, or I'm not sure why they were using those words. It seems like the words were being used more artistically liberated. I guess I'm saying it wrong, but it's
No.
There's supposed to be a purpose of what when you use a certain word, but it's very confusing to understand what do they mean exactly when they use vault instead of heaven.
Okay, I can answer that one. I actually can help you out. Okay, so part of what it is I would argue, as most mainline Protestants would, that this is not so much a historical account trying to explain exactly how things happened and what order that they did. Okay, but this is much more the setup for chapter 3. Okay. The
Okay.
point of chapter 1 and chapter 2 is say God created the universe. Not to explain how God did it, but to explain that he did do it. Okay. And then it's a setup to chapter 3, saying God created everything. When God created everything, God created it good. Now we're to chapter 3, and I know you guys haven't gotten there yet, but that's going to be the story of the fall. And you're going to have God come out and tell everyone, don't eat the amazing, wonderful, great, juicy fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. All the other fruit, you can have that, just not that one. Okay. Do the equivalent of putting a marshmallow on a table in front of a 3-year-old and saying, you can have anything else in the house but that one amazing marshmallow. Okay. And then walk away. And that whole story, at least in my opinion, would be a story about where does evil come from? Because one thing that people get caught up on, and we'll get to this more next time, one thing that stumbles people spiritually a lot is to say, now hold on, if God is good, if God is all good, all powerful, and all knowing, how can evil exist? Because doesn't an all powerful being that allows evil and suffering to occur, doesn't that make him not all good? Because wouldn't an all good, all powerful being get rid of evil? Okay. And so part of what chapter 1, 2, and 3 is doing is setting up a discussion about trying to address that very legitimate spiritual concern a lot of folks run across. But we first got to set up in chapter 1 and 2, God is all good. God created everything good. God loves his creation. And then what happens?
See, where I'm coming from, I've read a book called The Genesis Enigma.
Mhm.
It was written by a biologist, evolutionary biologist, who served as a president of the museum in London. I have the book, I think, and I can get it to you later, or I can tell
Absolutely.
you what it is exactly. But it basically enforces the concept that maybe the chapter 1 is more accurate than we realize, since it actually does support evolutionary theory.
Mhm. You could
Uh,
argue evolution. I have run across that argument before. It's intriguing.
And I guess where I'm coming from is that I understand how I've read different versions. I mean, I understand there's a King James version and new, all those kind of things. But I guess I don't understand why they were using the term vault versus just saying using. I mean, are they the same word, or is it just
I would
not to
have to
get?
go. You that's a really good question. I'd have to go back. My guess, but I'm going to be truthfully honest that what I'm doing is sort of guessing here, but I have to go back and look at the word. I know that there would have been concepts of the idea of sort of different levels, different parts. There's sort of there was an early idea that you sort of had a vault being like the sea to the bottom of the sea, another vault being the area surrounded by air, so the land to the sky, then like the sky to the heavens, and the
Yeah,
heavens
you're
and
talking about.
beyond.
Okay,
Which you
all
see,
right. I've seen illustrations like that. So
and,
okay, I understand
and
now.
so I think that's probably the illusion. I would need to go back and look at the actual Hebrew to know why maybe they chose that. What version of the Bible were you going with?
I Googled it, Genesis 1 and 2, and I
Sounds very
picked one
King
where
Jamesy to me, but
I want to say that you're right.
okay, because King
I'm
James
not
is,
familiar with King James version.
yeah, it's the first. It is an early English version commissioned by King James of England.
Right.
So it would that would vary. The English sort of understanding of things was very vaulted in their original sort of spiritualities.
Okay.
And again, medieval world using the word vaults for sort of areas, terrains, ecosystems would have made, if you said ecosystem to someone in the Middle Ages, they would have just been like, "You're a witch."
Hey.
Oh, because they would have no clue what you're talking about.
Okay.
So yeah.
There's a hymn that goes, "Now let the vault of heaven resound."
Mhm.
And I've never thought about totally what that means. I'm gonna have to look that up more.
Yeah, you guys feel free to look these things up because, like, I'll be honest, I am much better at the sort of theology and history than I am at Bible. So, this has definitely got to be a group project on some of these things.
In the NIV, Genesis 1, verse 6, and God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water.
Okay, yeah.
Now that's NIV. The King James Version uses the word firmament.
Yeah, see, my version, which is the NIV Study Bible, is saying, and God said, let there be an expanse between the waters. So it's using expanse rather than vault. Let me see if I have a note here real fast, because this is...
Mine's a dome.
The English Standard Version uses expanse, and the NASB uses expanse. And the CSB, I don't know what that is, uses expanse.
Yeah, so yeah, we're getting, I think the vault we probably have a word that sort of means all the things of a level. So an expanse, a vault, depending on your era, you're gonna have different words that will be common.
The easy one is NLT. There, God says, let there be a space between the waters.
Space would work too. All right, are we cool moving on to chapter 2?
Good here.
You guys good? All right.
Yeah.
Chapter 2, 3 things jumped out at me. First thing, verse 2, by the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. I do like to always point this out to folks, again, because one of the most natural things that psychology, by the way, would actually back is that in the course of 7 days, you need at least 36 hours of freedom where you get to rest, to rejuvenate. People say, well, you have 48 on the weekend. Well, do you? Because I don't know about you, my weekend is full of chores. Okay, I got a lot of chores to do. So getting 36 hours of rest, meaning not like you're sleeping or in bed, but like you get to decide what you want to do. We've learned it's psychologically important. So it's one of those notes in the Bible where you're like, hey, we knew this before the world knew this. I also like to note that if God needs to rest, none of us are God. We probably need to rest too. And to remind us that, hey, our worth is not because we produce things. Our worth is because we are loved. And we are loved by God. Because it's so easy to just work ourselves to smithereens, And by the way, even those of you who are retired, I've hung out with a lot of retired folks. I swear retired folks work more hours after they retire, as long as they're not within 3 weeks of that retirement date. Because I contend that what happens is week 1, you're like, woo, retired, and you like sleep. And then week 2 is like, I'm bored, let's go on an RV trip, or let's go fly to Tahiti. And then like you do that for 2 weeks, you come home because you eventually get tired of being in France or Tahiti or wherever. And then you're like, I'm bored. And then everyone's like, hey, you just retired, didn't you? Could you help me out? And then you say, yes, 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 yes. Because at first you're bored. And then you wake up 2 weeks later and you're like, how am I working 60 hours a week? Right? Yeah, I'm seeing some laughs of people who, right?
That's why you have to be careful in your first year of retirement, what you say yes to.
Yeah.
It was one of the best words of advice someone gave me.
Absolutely.
And I followed that.
That's good. That is good.
Now I'm sort of retired because of the pandemic.
Hey,
Yeah, we're all bored.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is, that God blessed the day and God rested. God didn't say you have to celebrate the Sabbath.
Right. No. Because celebration in itself can be exhausting, especially
I
if you're
mean,
the person who has to be hospitable. Like you would think me hanging out with my 3-year-old, my 1-year-old wouldn't be exhausting. Like, what do they want me to do besides get up every 5 seconds to bring them a pouchy of something?
yeah, I mean, it's interesting though. It seems that it's in some folks have made this into a commandment to and of course when we get to the commandments, I mean, I'll argue that too. You know, I was raised Catholic. I can't
Well,
help
and
rebelling, but you know, I'm not seeing it as a commandment that you have to do anything other than resting, or you know,
well, and
you don't even have to do it. It's not a commandment.
well,
In
and
the Peterson version, the messenger or the message, it does say he made it a holy day.
Mhm. But and what I would
Paid holiday, no work.
yeah, and I would honestly say what I think is probably, you know, I don't see it in a lot of Bibles, but the way I would interpret it when reading it would be to say when he says rest, what he really means is self-care. And for each person, self-care looks different. For some people, that might be going to the gym. For some people, that might be eating a chocolate lava cake. You know, to each their own sort of a thing, right? But taking time each week where you yourself are the center of your focus to care for yourself and ask yourself what is what at least as I get older becomes a harder and harder question, which is what would I want to do if I had 3 hours where I could just do whatever I want? Because I run so fast, you know, I got to do this for the kids and this for the spouse and this for the church and this for that or this. I've had a few times where I've stopped and I'm like, I don't actually know. I'm tired, but I don't know what I would do, you know? And I imagine other folks have run into that too. So I'm going to jump forward to verse 17. So verse 17, it's worth noting we're setting up chapter 3 here, which is going to be the fall. Okay. And so in verse 17, it's worth noting, but you must not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will surely die. Okay. Now, I always like to throw this out here. It's worth noting, any of you who've ever worked with humans knows that if you don't want someone to do something, the last thing you do is point to it and note whatever you do, don't do that. Because it will kill you. It will. I mean, I'm going to give you no more details, but something very bad would happen. Okay. So I'm going to argue, and I think, or at least I want to bring up as a possibility, that the fall is part of God's plan. Or at least he knows that it's coming. Because why else would you make such a big deal about whatever you do, eat anything but this? Because it sets the snake's argument up for the snake, which you will see again once we get to chapter 3. So I want to take a note of that, you know, because that'll become important, not really in this chapter, but next chapter. And then again, oh yeah.
I think I understand what you're saying, but the word on the screen, what's the, are you pointing out the word knowledge? Tree of the knowledge of good and evil, not of good and evil.
Good and evil. Oh, yes. Sorry. What I was trying to point out there was the tree. Some folks will try to interpret the tree and say that it allows them to do good and evil. Okay. But the actual verbiage is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is slightly different, right? It's not that
Right.
this is not Pandora's box. It's not that they release evil into the world. The snake is already there. When they eat of it, they simply become aware of the good and the evil around them. So they sort of come out of the cave of ignorance, or leave the naivete behind. which, as much as we look at the fall as a negative thing, and we'll get to this again next week, I'm going to argue that the fall wasn't pleasant, but was necessary, and at the end of the day was probably better than the alternative. That getting kicked out of the Garden of Eden was going to be the best possible scenario. I know everyone's going to, that's my teaser for next week. You can tell all your friends, come and learn why the fall was a good thing. Okay.
How else do you teach consequences? Actions have consequences. There it is.
Well, it's not just that actions have consequences. It's that, and I don't want to totally do too much of a spoiler here, but can you have love without freedom? And can you have freedom without choice? And can you have choice without evil? And I think that, to me, is at least what I get out of as we head into chapter 3, where I think we're going. But again, I keep wanting to try jump y'all to chapter 3, but I shouldn't. So verse 24, I'm just going to note again. For this reason, man will leave father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh. Okay. So this has often been used against all sorts of different groups, because this often gets really strictly read in this concept that, well, this is clear that there's one man and one woman, and one man and one woman leave, and they must go have a marriage, and the marriage, will have a white picket fence and a dog and 2 kids, and right, like you have all this other sort of imagery that the church has historically sort of thrown on top of this. So I want to step back from all that baggage that comes, not to say that it's wrong, but to give another possible interpretation of what's going on there, okay? What happens if this has nothing to do with marriage? What happens if this has to do, or at least the institution of marriage, what happens if this has to do with differentiation? So as a pastor, one of the things that I've seen be more destructive to marriages, particularly people who get married young, is that they've not what's called differentiated from a parent. In other words, when you are a kid, you relate to your parents, right? You essentially either rebel or you are like your parents. And then as you go through adolescence, almost everyone rebels. And then as you get into your 20s and 30s, you start to figure out, like, I can be something other than either exactly like my parents or exactly opposite of my parents, or other choices in that, right? Okay. That whole process that occurs is called differentiation. It's where you basically get to know yourself. It's why every college kid ever, regardless of generation, spends a chunk of time looking for themselves during their 20s. Okay. If you don't differentiate and understand who you are, at least on some very basic levels, and you get married, what you end up with is the dude who can't do his own laundry and takes it to his mother. Okay. Or the kid that ends up living in the basement forever. Okay. And you can imagine that that is not usually conducive to a really good relationship, right? Okay. So what happens if we've put the stress completely on the wrong place? Because we put it on the man and the woman. What happens if the stress of that statement is the leaving? That you got to become your own person before joining yourself to someone else is going to be successful. Because if you don't know who you are, you can't love yourself. And if you don't love yourself, then you're going to bring in a whole bunch of baggage into any relationship you're in. You know what I'm saying? Now, both could be true. It could be about both. One does not negate the other. Okay. But I always want to step back and just say, why have we chosen to look at this part, not that? What are y'all's thoughts?
I think it's true that you need to figure out who you are. You can't expect to find someone and get married, and that person is now going to life is going to be wonderful or whatever. You need to know who you are. And I think with young people, they haven't, like you said, they haven't figured out who they are. And as they are in their marriage, that they're young and they start to grow and become their person, suddenly there are times when you find out you are no longer kind of compatible. You've each gone, you've developed, and that can cause stress in the relationship.
Absolutely. It's worth noting lack of differentiation. Oh, sorry. Were you still talking, Phyllis?
Nope.
Oh, sorry. It's worth noting that lack of differentiation is actually linked with higher rates of affairs. It's why you find that usually, if you look at like what age is someone when they have an affair, they're usually younger rather than older. Not that people who are older don't have affairs, but it's usually when they're younger. And this is true across generations. So baby boomers, if you take all baby boomers who had an affair, they generally had an affair under the age of 30. But the same could be true of millennials. The same would be true of Gen Xers. Same would be true of silent gens, which makes the context of an affair look different. Like silent gens, most of those folks, when they're in their 20s or 30s, got married at 18, moved to the suburbs, and wife stayed home, husband went to work, so the affair was with the secretary, a la Mad Men. Where boomers, it might look a little different. Gen Xers, it might be, you have a different context, but it's often that same age gap because that's a period of time where you might very well be married, but not have differentiated. So you don't know who you are. So you start to grow away, but you don't know how to explain who you are to your spouse because you still don't quite know who you are. You just know it isn't working. And then you look for that emotional connection with someone else. And then one thing leads to another. Emotional becomes physical and an affair occurs. You know what I mean? And so again, that's why I would look at this, just having watched a lot of marriages, and say, for most people, I think the making sure you leave your parents, not in the dislike them, not in the don't have a good relationship, but make sure that, like, you know, I don't know how many women I've had who've been like, oh my God, my mother-in-law is making me insane. Right? Because the husband is going to his mom and being like, Mom. Okay. Or sometimes the wife going to dad and being like, Dad, can you help us out in the situation, and not actually communicating with the guy or with her husband.
Oh, there is the mother-in-law that's trying to politely warn you off.
That's a whole different circumstance.
The lack of differentiation.
That's a whole different.
Saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Not saying anything bad against mother-in-laws. Mother-in-laws can be wonderful. I have a great mother-in-law who I get along with incredibly well. But I'm just saying I've seen relationships where, again, even in the scenario I was giving, it wasn't the mother-in-law's fault. It's the spouse that is running to mom, or the spouse that is running to dad, rather than working it out with their other spouse. Cool. Anything that jumped out to you guys from the chapter 2? If not, I only have one last comment before we. Oh, Gail, you're gonna say something? Oh, sorry, suddenly flipped over to you. So, all right. So one last comment. I call these thematic insights, meaning that I can't isolate it to just one chapter. I made up the word. So if you've never heard that before, don't worry, I made it up. Problem of Lilith. Okay. I am an avid anti-literalist. Okay. I do not believe that you can take the Bible literally, mainly because I've met hundreds of people who say they're literalists, and every time I ask them a literal question, they eventually give it and do something not literal. Okay. So it's not that I'm saying that what literalists say are wrong. I'm just saying they're not literal, and therefore since none of us are being literal, there's a lot more freedom out there. Okay. Problem of Lilith is one of the key issues with literalism. So chapter 1, folks, this is my quiz, you guys, so listen up. Chapter 1, on day 6, God creates humanity. He creates them what and what?
Nope, sorry.
Male and
Female.
female. So we have a man and we have a woman on day 6, right? Okay.
Yes.
Now, if you are a true literalist, chapter 2 comes after chapter 1 because chapter 2 happens after chapter 1. Now, I will tell you right now, chapter 2 does not happen after chapter 1. There's a lot of hints in there, but to do that would be to use a literary interpretation, not a literal interpretation, right? So chapter 2, Adam is wandering around. He is lonely and he is naming animals. God sees that he needs a partner in life, so goes ahead and puts him to sleep, and out of his rib, he creates
Eve.
Eve.
With-
You have a numerical problem. Who is the other woman? Okay. Now, the correct answer to that is we can't be literal. We're talking about, one is talking about the creation of all the world and all the universe, and that God created us male and female. And the other one is an explanation of what basically occurs in the story, of which we just sort of had an overview of. Okay. But to do that is to not be literal. So there are only two ways out of this: either give up on literalism or give a name to the third woman, or to the second woman, sorry. And that is where the stories of Lilith come from. Is a group of fundamentalist Jews backed into this corner early on in Judaism who made up a midrash about another woman, who they gave the name to Lilith. It went horrifically awry historically. I'm not going to get on a recorded line about exactly all the weird stuff that they then contributed to Lilith, because I try to keep this PG at least. But it's worth noting, if you ever get into a battle with the literalist, hit them with this right off the bat, because there really isn't a good way out of it. Because what they're going to tell you is, oh, they're two different stories. Well, okay, that's great and that's right, but it ain't literal. So there's my stick it to the literalist, and I'll probably have one of these just about every time, because if you read the Bible, you quickly learn you can't take it literally. And thanks be to God that we can't, because there's so much more richness when you don't. All right, next week. Any questions about the Lilith thing? It's, by the way, where the Lilith fair comes from.
Right. Could we bring that up in a pubology thing?
You could totally bring it up in a pubology thing, because I do need
Okay.
some beer to talk about Lilith.
Yeah.
I did not drink.
I've done my own research on Lilith, and it's interesting.
Interesting is a word for it. That's a very Wisconsin way of describing it.
Mhm.
Everyone is now Googling Lilith.
Right.
Just
You
make
do
sure you have your
realize-
filters on.
On every sitcom now that the character's named Lilith.
Yes. Frasier, if you watch the old show
Yeah.
Frasier, that was
Exactly.
actually done on purpose, which they reveal, I forget what
Oh,
season
wow.
it was, because she's sitting next to the guy who played Data on Next
Yeah.
That's
Generation.
right. Yeah.
And he asks her, like, where's your name from? And she said, the evil demon, da 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 da.
Oh my
Lilith,
God.
who destroyed the world. And he's like, oh, well, that's interesting. Anyways, any other questions? But yes, that can be totally a pub theology question. All
You
right.
said that you compared to chapter 1 and 2 as two different stories. Correct?
Yeah, they're two different
Okay.
stories.
Wasn't there a more historical reference as to why they were put in the Bible?
Okay, so some historians would believe that you had two different sort of Genesis writings or oral traditions that were then combined together. That's sort of speculation, because there's no way to prove that two different oral traditions existed that many years ago.
Okay.
you do have a lot of hints that could be true. Like it's not that it's like out of bounds as an idea. You look at it, the Hebrew's a little different. You have different eras. You have some different sayings. And so you can sort of squint and say, well, I wonder if these two came from different times or different backgrounds. And that combined with the reality that you probably had multiple immigrations from Egypt to Israel, plus you probably had some Israelites who never got taken to Egypt historically to become slaves. You, from an archaeological standpoint, you may be dealing with the immigrants' creation story versus the creation story of those who stayed behind.
Okay.
But all that's speculation. There's no, but you can't prove, but you also can't disprove those sorts of assertions. Because again, they're all asserting, well, this oral tradition went here. Well, how do you prove? Because you say, well, you never found evidence of it written down. They say, of course not, it's oral. So like I think there's some interesting, intriguing arguments. I personally say they're two stories, they're interrelated, and again, I get away from the archaeological stuff, and sort of say, what is God trying to tell me in the text? What's going to help me in my life? How does this help my spirituality? But that doesn't negate any of the archaeological stuff too. Other questions?
Okay.
I love chatting. That sort of answer the question. I'm very good at not actually answering questions and thinking that I do.
No, it makes
I
me
guess I
think
just
of,
had trouble.
it makes me think of, there's two siblings know the family story, and then you tell it over and over in your respective families, and you get back to the family reunion and the story's morphed a little bit because of the reaction you got when you were telling the story in your separated nuclear,
Absolutely. Or like when I lived in DC for a while, I was part of an exchange program where you had people from all over the world working in DC together. And we all resided together in DC. And so we had a group of fellow students who were from France, and they got really homesick, and they had heard about how Quebec people speak French and how French culture is so strong in Quebec. And so they decided that they would go ahead and go through all the painstaking stuff to go from the US to Canada as French citizens, okay? Which that's a lot of legal hoops, by the way, especially on a student visa. So they go up there, and they were so excited to get to speak French with folks, only to learn that the Quebecois speak French, but it's a French dialect that got frozen in the 1600s.
Wow.
And so they couldn't understand a word that the folks in Quebec were saying, because it split off from French, kept the old what we would see as like old English territory, like if we were trying to talk to George Washington. But then whenever a new thing would come along, they would layer on a sort of Francist-sized version of an English word. So like when computers didn't exist when Quebec was connected to France. So when a computer comes back, they're like, computier. That's not actually French. That's just like that's like letting Joey from Friends try to figure out how to speak French. And so they had no clue. They were so disappointed when they came back. And so I think what you may very well have is similar to what you're saying, Gail, in the sense of you have two different stories told from two different perspectives that may have been preserved in two different places. Doesn't mean that either's not true. At least in the sense of the things that matter. About the fact that God loves us, God created us. God created not just us, but everything that is. And therefore is the ruler, is the king of all. And that divine spirit loves us so much to direct all of creation around us. That no matter how small we feel, we are at the center of what God cares about. All right. Next week, because I try to keep these things to about an hour. Those of you who know me from pub theology know I fail almost every time. Next week, what I wanted to do is we're going to read chapter 3, which is the story of the fall. Okay, read these ahead of time, please. Chapter 4, which is Cain and Abel. Yep, it only took 4 chapters before humanity was offing each other. Chapter 5 is a boring chunk of genealogy. It's worth a read. I will do a mention or two of it because there's a few interesting things in it. But if you're going to skip a chapter, skip chapter 5. Okay. Or if you're going to skim a chapter, skim chapter 5. There isn't much in there. And then we're going to do chapter 6, just verses 1 through 4. Why? Because there's this weird little story about angels getting it on that is stuck between the end of the Cain and Abel story and Noah. Okay, and you think I'm kidding? Genesis 6, 1 through 4, it's its own standalone story. And then the rest of 6, you begin the Noah story, which most of us know, except for the PTSD drunken parts. There's my see, I just try to keep you guys coming back. Most of you are like, I'm never coming back. All right, so that's the goal. If you guys are okay, I'm gonna go ahead and end the recording here to keep it around an hour-ish, okay? So I'm gonna stop, I have to stop sharing the screen, and then I will stop the recording.